Thank you, everyone, and good morning. Hope you're enjoying the conference. It's been great for me to be back in Austin. I don't know if some of you were here about 6 years ago. I spoke in one of the rooms over there in the conference on threat modeling, and what a change over the last number of years. And to be back here again talking about threat modeling is just really my honor. I really appreciate it and enjoy talking about this topic wherever I can. So just to introduce myself, Robert Hurlbut. I am at Acquia. I'm involved in a few things. I lead some local groups, an Amherst security group, for example, up in Western Mass. That's where I'm located, up in the Northeast. But actually, I'm from here originally, this area, this part of the country. And so it's always great, again, to get back into this area. I am also the co-host of the Application Security Podcast with Chris Romeo. We've been doing that since 2016. I'm a co-author of the Threat Modeling Manifesto, as well as a co-founding member of Threat Modeling Connect. We'll talk about those in a moment. And then also just recently this year, I started some studies, a PhD student focused on space cybersecurity. It's a new, interesting field that I'm looking at. So I'm also, as I mentioned, with Acquia. Acquia is a service-disabled, veteran-owned small business. We focus on a lot of areas in cybersecurity. It's a small company, but mostly we're focused on the public sector, as well as some commercial projects. It's really interesting things that we do. I've been there for 2 years. If you're interested, ask me about Acquia. At the end, I'd love to tell you about some of the things that we've been doing. So today we're going to be looking at threat modeling, a really brief introduction and review, and then we're going to dive right into threat modeling plus Agile DevOps. So many people say you can't do that. Once you're going into Agile, once you're a DevOps shop, threat modeling gets pushed aside, and we're going to talk about some ways that you can actually do threat modeling in an Agile DevOps world. So threat modeling, just to really take a moment and step back. I've been doing threat modeling for many, many years. I think I was first introduced into threat modeling about 2003. I was a developer then. I've been a developer for many, many years. And I remember at the time when you're talking about security, there was a lot of peripheral security, talking about the outside, firewalls, things like that. And not enough talk about application security. How do I make sure I have good, secure applications? And so there was a book that came out from some folks at Microsoft on threat modeling. I read that. I said, this is what I've been looking for. How can I think about secure design and build that into my systems? Fast forward to maybe about 10 years ago, there really wasn't a lot of talk about this, but then a few years later, we started to get some books that came out and some other folks talking about it. And really since 2019, just in the last few years, there's been a tremendous amount of talk about threat modeling. In particular, the Threat Modeling Manifesto, I mentioned that a moment ago. I and a number of others in threat modeling community got together in the summer of 2020, and we put together this document, a way to get started with threat modeling. Very easy, quick way to talk about the values and principles and anti-patterns. And if you notice, it says manifesto. It's patterned after the Agile Manifesto, which came out many, many years ago. OWASP, the top 10 2021, for the first time, added this particular item in secure design, A04, where basically the focus is insecure design is causing all kinds of problems. And the solution is threat modeling. How do I start to think about good secure design? NIST in 2021 also came out with a document, a recommendation that if you're looking at vendor or other developer-produced code, ask for a threat model. See if a threat model is there. And then finally, as I mentioned, Threat Modeling Connect, I'm a part of this. It's been a fantastic opportunity over the last year, seeing so many people, more and more people interested in threat modeling. And we just celebrated 1 year. We're actually going to be having our first threat modeling conference that's coming up this Sunday. I'll be speaking there as well, heading to DC tomorrow right after this. So great opportunity and great opportunities really to see how threat modeling has continued to grow over the years. One last thing I'll mention is CISA, which is a group of different government agencies that have collected together to try to build out some ideas about security. This document came out earlier this year and it just revised in the last week. Shifting the balance of cybersecurity risk, principles and approaches to security by design and default. And a couple of things that they mention: use a tailored threat model during resource allocation development to prioritize the most critical and high impact features. Threat models consider a product's specific use case and enable development teams to fortify products. So again, threat modeling over the last few years has become more and more in our vocabulary. We keep talking about it, and I've heard it several times in this conference already. Shannon mentioned it several times yesterday in her keynote talk. Of course, Tony spoke about it in his talk on risk threat modeling. And then I've also heard others mention it and say, threat modeling is just something that's here, and we need to think about how do we apply it. So what is threat modeling? Let's just take a step back. Threat modeling is something we're already doing. Anytime that we're locking the doors to our house or our windows, we lock the doors to our car, or we look around across the street, we're already thinking about what could go wrong, what could happen. How do I address those issues? Now, it's more intuitive. We don't just say, okay, let me sit down, let me write down a threat model, let me build out this thing. No, it's already there. It's already part of who we are when we're thinking about our personal security, personal safety. We're already thinking about those things. But essentially what that is we're thinking ahead on what could go wrong. We're asking those what-if questions. We weigh risks, we act accordingly, and that's a kind of threat modeling. Now, this is a definition from the Threat Modeling Manifesto: analyze representations of a system to highlight concerns about security and privacy characteristics. And so what does that mean versus what it's not? Well, what it's not is not pen testing. It's not code review. It's not a lot of automated scans. Instead, it's really trying to think. It's a thinking tool. And the beauty of that being a thinking tool, anybody can get started with this. Anybody can do it. And we already mentioned that. But when we're analyzing representations of a system, it might be just a description. What are you doing? What are you working? What are you trying to build here? And maybe it's a diagram that helps you describe that. And while you analyze that, you're thinking about what are the security issues and how do those impact the design? What are the privacy issues perhaps in this system, and how do those impact your design as well as your business goals? So typically a threat model consists of these several items. So system representation, it could be a diagram, it could be a description, or a combination of both. Identified threats, any mitigations against those threats. And sometimes we also include risks that are prioritized based on those mitigations that we've identified or proposed to address those identified threats. Now, I like to go back to this document that came out in 2015. It's not specifically focused on threat modeling, but I do like some of the things that it brought out. A bug, the difference between a bug and a flaw. A bug is an implementation level software problem. A flaw, on the other hand, is a deeper level problem, usually a mistake or an oversight at the design level. And in threat modeling, that's really what we're focused on. We're not doing code reviews. Instead, we're trying to find those system flaws, those design decisions that have been made. Some of the more common ones we see are getting mixed up between authentication and authorization, or configuring authorization incorrectly. We've seen that a few times. And so what we're, again, trying to do with threat modeling is how do we focus in on those kinds of issues? And so again, we're not looking at coding bugs, coding errors, all kinds of issues like that. All that can be automated. Instead, we're really focused on errors in design, security requirements, architecture. It's not very easy to automate. There are some parts you can. We'll talk about that a little bit today. But the key thing I'll mention here is that, whenever we find those issues later, it can be much more difficult to implement them. So that's why we always say, ideally do threat modeling early. Authentication, authorization, especially access control. Jim mentioned that in his keynote this morning. Very, very difficult to get right. And that's where a threat model can really help. Think about the design, think about the areas that I need to put access control in place and the best ways to do it. That is not easy to automate. In fact, very difficult to automate, very difficult to find those issues. So that's, again, where threat modeling comes into play. So again, when do you do threat modeling? You can do all these other things, pen tests and so forth, all very good actions and activities that you do. Threat modeling can help you to give input into those activities. Those activities can help you with thinking about threats that are being found or vulnerabilities that lead into threats. So there's that sort of a synergy between the two. Now, as we've already mentioned, ideally you're doing threat modeling early. And so you can see here the SDLC process. Usually it's requirements and design, development, testing, deployment. For threat modeling, we typically say, do this early. And so we like to say somewhere in the requirements design. But the reality is you can continue to do this, continue to update it, continue to review it as you go along. But ideally start early if you can. So getting started, very easy, very quick. A diagramming tool if you want to use that. You can use a whiteboard just to do some brainstorming, just think about the types of things that you're building. That could be a real whiteboard or it could be a virtual one, and a way to document. It could be Word, it could be Jira, Confluence, whatever you have, document what you find. Very, very simple. This is just a worksheet to track some of the things that you find, the threats and mitigations and so forth. The process, very easy. Let's dive into that. So when you're considering what to threat model or when you're threat modeling, you want to ask some questions. What do you want to protect? What does that care about? And protect it from? How likely is it that you will need to protect it? And how bad are the consequences if you fail? And how much trouble are you willing to go through in order to try to prevent those? So some very basic questions just to get started. Now, the Threat Modeling Manifesto has introduced 4 questions to make it even simpler to dive into the process. So the first one is, what are we working on? What do we care about? What's this story? What's this thing that I'm trying to do here? Set your scope very quickly and early. And then ask questions. What can go wrong? What could happen? What if somebody was able to do the opposite of what I expected here? And so on. And then what are we going to do about it? That's where the mitigations come in. And did we do a good enough job? Or you go back and review, is there anything I missed? Sometimes you'll find a threat and then the mitigation, but the mitigation leads into, potential other threats if that got compromised. And then you're starting to build in that good defense in depth. And so you just go back and review. Is there anything else we missed? Is there anything else that I can add? Now, we feel pretty good about this right now. Let's go with this. It's our design. The beauty of threat modeling is a threat model is not ever, I think it's the beauty anyway, it's not ever done. I know we say, well, geez, that doesn't sound like a great thing. But the reality is our systems are never done. How many of you have stopped developing anything? Okay, no one. Everybody's continuing to develop, continuing to respond to customers, building new features, and that means also our threat models will change. We'll have new threats introduced. We'll have new attack surfaces. And so that's where that did you do a good enough job? We're good for now, but we are open and willing to update our threat model as we go along. So what are we working on? Understand, diagram your system. Identify threats through answers to questions on what could go wrong. Determine mitigations and risks. And did we do a good enough job is review and follow through. So let's just take a look at understanding. So first of all, I always say gather your team, getting folks together. Because everybody knows the system, and that's a good collection of people to get in a room. Domain knowledge, business goals, technical goals, and also make sure the sessions are focused. You don't need to spend a whole day doing a threat model. In fact, ideally, early on, you might do 1 or 2 hours, 3 hours, depending, and just get a good high-level view of what your system is. I always say, when you start, though, be honest, leave ego at the door, and no blaming. It's so easy to get started and say, geez, we missed that completely. What were you thinking? Don't do that. It's a learning time. It's a discovery time. And then, of course, be sure to document what you learned. For diagramming, you can use architecture or network diagrams. In many cases, the data flow diagram is very useful. The reason for that is that basically it's helping us understand one of the most crucial and critical parts of our system to attackers, the data. Where's the data stored? Who has access to that data? Can anybody manipulate that data in some way? Now, these are just some basic elements of a data flow diagram. They mean different things. A couple that I'll just focus on. The entities, external usually means it's something that's outside of our control. So it could be, let's say, for a web application, the browser. It could be other clients. It could be users. We don't have control over users and what they do to our systems, right? So those are things that we want to identify as our external entities. They may or not necessarily be external to us. They could be simply external to our system, or we may interact with those systems. The other is a process. A process is everything else. It's basically anything that's action, anything that's a component, anything that we built, anything that we have some kind of control over. So it's good to distinguish those two, and it helps us to think about the particular kinds of threats. Data stores, data flows. Trust boundary is the last one I'll mention. Trust boundary is an interesting one. It's just really trying to help us understand where trust changes, inside, outside, or all around. Depending on where our application is, where we are in our application, do we have some level of trust that's changing? Is there authentication that needs to happen, authorization, validation? Those are all trust activities that we need or may need to have inside of our system somewhere. So here's the example data flow diagram. This one was drawn by the OWASP Threat Dragon tool, which is a free tool available to anyone if you'd like to get started with that. So that's our diagram. Next is we identify threats. What could go wrong? Now, sometimes they're more obvious than other times. Anybody see any problems with this one? This is an actual thing that actually happened near where I live. I don't know why the police pulled them over, but I have a pretty good idea. So sometimes this is a little bit more obvious, and actually the title of this article in the newspaper was, when you go out and taking the roads, ask the question, what could go wrong? All kinds of potential things. Sometimes it's more obvious than not, but other times we're not sure where to get started. So here's a good rule of thumb. If a threat actor can acquire an asset by abusing, bypassing a control, you have a threat. Now, Stride is a mnemonic. It's been around for almost over 20 years. It's just a good way to get started. Spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, elevation of privilege. These are, again, just some basic ways of looking for threats. And if you notice, they're all based on some very common or fundamental security principles. So what we want, identity assurance and authentication, integrity to deal with tampering, non-repudiation, basically proof. Repudiation is a lack of proof. Non-repudiation is simply I have proof or auditability in place. Confidentiality, availability, least privilege, authorization. Now, if you notice, it's basically the CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability, and maybe the 3 A's, the authentication, authorization, and auditability with non-repudiation. That's basically it. You're just looking for those common issues within a system. That's what Stride helps you to do. Now, the reality is there's many other ways to identify threats. Stride just one of them. Linden is privacy focused. You can use attack trees. PASTA is a risk-centric methodology that Tony talked about yesterday in his talk. MITRE ATT&CK is really a knowledge base that helps you with sort of like trees that you're building out and thinking about the different kinds of ways that attackers can attack your system, get into your system, and sort of jump into different areas. You can use card games, use case, abuse cases, many, many different ways to identify threats. Now, we want to determine our mitigations and risks. And so this is Stride, where it's got a lot of different sample example controls. For example, non-repudiation is really logs and making sure to manage those and monitor those. Availability, rate limiting. Of course, for authorization issues, you want to make sure you have a good central authorization engine, good access control, and so forth. So a lot of good controls that are available that help you. Once you've identified the threats, what are the good mitigations? Now, you have some options, of course. You can leave it. We figured out there's a threat, but we're simply just not going to deal with it. You can remove that issue. If you find out a particular issue in the system that is leading to a potential threat, remove that feature. You can remedy with a technology countermeasure. That's ideal. Or just simply warn the user, hey, there's an issue here. I see that quite often if you go, for example, to a coffee shop and it says free Wi-Fi, but beware, that's the threat, right? Somebody could easily grab your data if it's unprotected in a Wi-Fi, open Wi-Fi. That's the warn user. Now, what I like to say is make those mitigations and countermeasures part of your security acceptance criteria. So this is a good way that a threat model can really help drive what are my tests, what are the things that I need to look for. Now, again, continuing with risk, what is risk associated with that threat? And there's just the basic definition of risk. Risk is ease of exploitation, business impact. And you can apply all kinds of other risk management activities, FAIR, or just the basic risk rating. And that'll help you then to determine, again, now that I have not mitigated that threat, what is the likelihood of that happening? What's the impact of that? And that can help you prioritize. And then finally, review and follow through. Document findings and decisions, file bugs or new requirements. Verify, of course, those are fixed. Did we miss anything? Go review again. Anything new, review again. There's basic tools out there, lots of automated tools, lots of tools that help you draw diagrams, help you record threats, and so on. Lots of good things out there that are available to you that have been built over the last 10 years or so, which is fantastic. Now, here's what we're really wanting to get into. That's great. Threat modeling is fantastic. Interesting thing to do. I think it'll be a great thing for us to do. However, the number one thing I hear from shops that are saying, we're Agile, we're DevOps, we don't have time for that. Anybody ever heard that before? We don't have time for that. We're too busy. We're busy working. We're busy doing stuff. We're coding. We're deploying all the time. We don't have time to stop and think for a moment, which is really what it is, right? But the reality is you are always thinking. You're always designing. I've never seen a DevOps shop ever that didn't design on the fly, that didn't think on the fly. They're always doing that. So how can we take some of the benefits and the value of threat modeling and help us in those situations? Let's take a look at the value of threat modeling. Ed Moyle mentioned this in an article back in 2017. Very few organizations have the time or resources to threat model their entire ecosystem. And that's so true. We just can't do it all. However, assuming you don't have that luxury, you can still realize quite a bit of value just by adopting the mindset of looking for blind spots and questioning assumptions. So that's the first place there, just to help teams to think about, let me question this for a moment. I know what the requirements are, I know what the stories are, but where are the blind spots? And what are my assumptions that this will always work the way I expect? Is there a possibility that there's an opposite of that, where something could go wrong? And with that in mind, this is a slide that Adam Shostak has shared several times in some of his talks at Black Hat and other places, where he compares this sort of a old style waterfall, lots of documents, lots of things, big complex scope and so forth, to a more agile approach, where you're thinking actually instead of more a tiny scope, stories, and thinking about, what am I working on right now, this very small thing? How can I start to apply some of these ideas, this spot checking, this questioning assumptions, this not sure what's happening here, let me just take a closer look. Now, finding threats, you can do brainstorming, stride, kill chain, all those things just like you did before. They all apply. For fixes, you have, of course, controls and so forth. On the other side, on the Agile side, you may have spikes to understand, security-focused stories, acceptance criteria. And then, of course, for quality, you have test automation on the Agile side. So all kinds of really great tools that you can use that can help you, that can still allow you to do a lot of what you're doing here. And by the way, another thing I've heard, in fact, I just heard it a moment ago before I spoke, is one of the things that people say, well, I don't want to do threat modeling because I don't want to draw diagrams. I don't have time for that. There are so many tools today that can help you get started with a diagram on an existing system. So start where you are. And I always say, just start where you are. You can get a diagram and go from there. And then for anything new, you can build out or diagram that if you need to, or just describe it. So in an Agile DevOps world, our SDLC, our design phases and all that looks similar to this now. So threat modeling is in there as well for new requirements, but it's more of an incremental threat modeling. It's more of Agile and DevOps approach with user stories and abuser or attacker stories. And so I like to say for incremental threat modeling, start wherever you are and just build a baseline. And it doesn't have to be very complicated, just where are we? What's the system look like? How does it look? And most teams I've ever worked with, they already have some kind of diagram, or even if they don't, just come in and let's just talk about how the system works. And now we've got a baseline threat model. We know what some of the common threats are. We know how you've addressed them. Now we can go from there. And so then you can update and review your threat model as you go along and adding new features. Now, there are many out-of-band activities. For example, sprint planning, spikes. Just add threat modeling as another one. Or, in addition, when you create user stories, you can, again, focus on a threat model or just a spot check threat model. So user stories, we know, are typically written like this. As a type of user, I want some goal, so that's for some reason. Security user stories, you could use those. The only thing about security user stories is that, like these, as a user, I want to log in. As a user, I want to be able to see my account, and so on. The only problem with this is you can have so many of these to track. It makes it much more difficult. I like to advocate more abuser or attacker stories, where you sort of turn this around. And so they do this a little differently. As someone with malicious intent, I want to do some bad thing. So some examples: as a hacker, I want to read the application log files. As an insider, I want to access the customer's account information. As a disgruntled employee, I want to change pricing for some products. And so these change this around. So now that I have this attacker story, how do I build in good defenses against it? How do I find out that's happening? How do I monitor it? Do I have good logging in place? And so on. And here's an example using the latest OWASP Top 10, 2021, from 2021, A7 identification and authentication failures. And so some particular stories around that, like abuse cases and so forth. So we've already said this earlier, have your team. So in the same way, in sprint planning, you have your team. You're focused on a scope of the set of stories. Understand requirements, keep business and technical goals in mind. And just like I said before, be honest, leave ego at the door, and no blaming. And prioritize issues in the backlog. Work through your user and abuser stories or attacker stories. Determine the threats and mitigations as you go along. And as you find these, write them out to the backlog. And prioritize based on risk, much like what we talked about before. So all these things still apply. It's just at a smaller detail as you go along. And value of DevOps and threat modeling, it's not for developers only. In the past we said threat modeling is only for developers. We get the developers in the room, but the reality is everybody can be involved. And that's the beauty, again, of DevOps. Operations can bring a great perspective. They have functional misuse that they're aware of, creative situations that no one considered in design. And then, as I like to say, it brings everyone to the table. I've been a part of a lot of the threat model sessions where just having not just the developer, but the architect, the testers, those who are in operations, all together, being able to see different parts of the system. There are several advantages to that. One is that everybody can contribute. No one has all the answers, and having the team together like that can help with the answers. And everybody gets to learn about the system. I find that some people become too compartmentalized and don't understand how their particular part interacts with everybody else. But having a threat model can bring everyone together. Everybody's learning. Everybody's helping to not only understand the design, but also improving the design. And that's a lot about what we talk about in DevOps, continuous improvement. So threat modeling, again, is a great way to do that as well. So just mention some approaches that are out there. This book came out a number of years ago, Epic Failures in DevSecOps. There was a chapter, Threat Modeling a Disaster. What a great title, right? It's an interesting story, and I actually got to speak with Edwin. Worked at a bank, and in particular, they use threat modeling tool. Threat modeling tool is not a bad tool, but it is difficult to scale, as he mentioned. And one of their solutions was to start looking at threat modeling in code and tests, and building out some of their expectations in the code and tests, and applying RRA. We'll take a look at RRA. Is something that Mozilla put together a number of years ago, rapid risk assessment. And so instead of having to do a full threat model every time, they do an RRA in 30 minutes. Now this applies to lots and lots of microservices that they're using. So it's a very focused approach, but they have tens of thousands of microservices that they're running. And so what they do is they focus on the services and the entry points when there's a change, and they ask these simple questions. Are you making changes to the attack surface? In other words, new entry points. Are you changing the application stack or application security controls? Are you adding confidential or sensitive data? Have threat agents changed? Are we facing new risk? If you can say yes, or do say yes to any of these questions, then maybe you need to look a little further. If you say no, no major changes like this, no impact to the security for this service change, then you're good to go and you move on. So here's another great way to increase your productivity, your velocity as you move along. RRA is one solution. Now this is one that was proposed by Azar and Matt. Azar spoke here last year. Threat model every story, continuous threat modeling. So the idea there is that you pick a story, you find security value. Is this story, does it have some kind of security value? Yes, threat model that story. Develop, mitigate it, create a ticket. No, then continue on, develop, move to next, repeat. So basically it's looking at every story and just asking the question, are there any security implications here? Can I actually apply a threat model here? Can I think about what could go wrong here and just build that out from there? So it's a way of continually applying these principles and these ideas as you go along rather than having to do everything. Now, I mentioned threat modeling as code. That was also mentioned in that chapter. There's been some good solutions that have come out in the last number of years. It's an interesting approach. There's either threat modeling from code, in code, or with code. So this one, Threat Playbook by Abhay Bhargava, is one where they focused on basically the code that's along with it, your infrastructure code, building out your code that's looking at your system and thinking about the threat models that you build inside of that using, in this case, the robot framework. And so they would say, oh, here's my user story, I build out a threat model, and then I build in my use cases, my test cases, mitigation inside of my testing for my integration, and just run that. And it's a good way to verify your threat model. It's a good way to make sure that it's working the way you expect, the system working the way you expect. And there's a sample YAML file. This one hasn't been updated in a while, but the approach I really like, and some others you'll see in a moment have adopted or certainly continued this idea. Threat modeling in code, threat spec is basically attributing your code. And so you can put in various attributes. This is my data flow, or this is something like that. This is a process, something I own. This is a call to an entity that I don't own, and so on. And as a result, you can actually, this will allow you to diagram or build diagrams from your code just by the fact that you've attributed your code. And so you'll get some generated DFDs. And so here's one example. And it can help you build, again, your threat model in your code with attributes in your code. The last one, or one of the last ones, is threat modeling with code, PyTM. This is done by Azar, and it's still active, continuing to be updated. So if you're fluent with Python, you can write threat models using code. In this case, with Python, they have a library, so you can build out, okay, this is my actor, this is my entity that I don't own, this is my process I do own, and so forth. And you can build those out. And as a result, again, you can have diagrams that get generated for your data flow diagrams. So you can sort of go back and forth. Some folks are more, it's easier to write code than it is necessarily to draw diagrams. So here's a good way to do that as well. A couple other instances I'll mention through Agile is also a YAML related type of product where you're building out threat models in YAML so that you can then generate whatever you need and as well as work against the code that you have for testing and so forth. The last example I mentioned, HCLTM. So in this case, you're using HashiCorp's HCL2 to build out your files and simply to generate some of the data flow diagrams from your system. It's looking at your code. It's able to, in your infrastructure, able to build out some threat models for you and to track those as well. Another thing I'll mention is threat modeling your CI/CD pipeline. There are some great tools that are available now. For example, this one from Cybersecurity, top 10 CI/CD security threats. And so I always recommend that whenever you're starting to build out your infrastructure, also threat model your infrastructure. When you're building out your pipeline, threat model your pipeline. And think about the common things that you've seen. Over the years, especially as we continue to be more and more involved in pipelines and building out good pipelines, I've asked questions. Okay, let's not just look at your application, but let's look at your pipeline. How are you getting the data? How are you getting the libraries? What are you doing to build this together? Are there any authentication issues? And so on. And I found all kinds of issues when we've done that. And teams say, oh, we didn't even think about that. We just sort of put things together and hope it worked. But building a good threat model around how it works and how it's put together is always a good win. You can use a lot of the existing threat libraries. I mentioned many different ways to identify threats, so MITRE KPEC. A lot of teams are using attack or defend, which again are just knowledge bases, so those are some good tools to use as well. And then finally, I wanted to mention this. This was a question that was posed to me a few months ago when I presented this, and at the time, it's still new, as Jim mentioned in his keynote this morning, it's still new. We're on an interesting trajectory of lots and lots of things happening with AI. What I'd say about that with threat modeling and generative AI is that AI can help us automate some of the mapping of those components to potential threats and identify attack surfaces, all kinds of automated things it can do. It can train on the data that we have, the various attacks, the various vulnerabilities, and so on. And it can help with, again, automation, efficiency, real-time monitoring, all kinds of great things that AI can do for us. However, we still need human expertise to discern the data quality. That hasn't gone away. So as I mentioned very early on, threat modeling is a thinking tool. And so AI can absolutely help us with a lot of what we're doing, help us to look at the data and start to build out some potential threats and components that are in the system and how they might be attacked and so forth. Great things they can do. But we still need humans to discern, does this work? Could it work? Could it happen? And so on. As well as right now, no AI really can detect completely a zero-day attack. Those are things it may not know about. It only knows what it knows. And things that it may not know or may not realize are happening, a lot of times can be evaluated after the fact. So just be aware. But absolutely, I think it's a great tool. Use it as a tool to help you do what you're doing, and again, to help your velocity and productivity as you combine these ideas, these approaches with some of the work that you're doing. So what's next? I like to say, learn everything you can also about privacy threat modeling. More and more, this is going to become an issue. Of course, in Europe, it's been that for a number of years. In California and many other states, it's already an issue where you need to be aware of privacy, you need to be tracking it. It's going to become more and more of an issue through all the states as we think about this and how do we protect customer data. Attack trees, take a look at those. Incremental threat modeling, there's some more resources. And of course, check out Attack and Defend, those two resources from MITRE. So, conclusion. So threat modeling is too important not to do it. I know we said at the beginning that one of the biggest arguments is that we don't have time to do it, but we do need to do it. We need to take some time. And we're always designing, we're always thinking. And so threat modeling is too important not to do it. And as I mentioned there, we still need to think about secure design. And find ways to integrate threat modeling into your sprints, DevOps processes, your attacker abuser stories that you might write, quick reviews, automated threat analysis, anything that you might have that is out there, make use of it. All together, that's going to help you with your threat models as you build them. Some resources, Manifesto, Threat Modeling Connect. There's a number of books that are available. You can take a look at those. If you're interested in just applied threat modeling, this one, Hacking Kubernetes, is one of my favorites. Came out a couple of years ago. Excellent book, taking you through, if you're building anything in Kubernetes, taking you through from start to finish, how do I think about the threat models for the systems I'm building, attack trees, and so on. Lots of great examples, lots of walkthroughs, so highly recommend that book if you're interested. And then for threat modeling medical devices, that playbook is also a really good step-by-step, how do I build or use threat modeling to help me build more secure medical devices. And then there's an article, Integrating Threat Modeling with DevOps. Some tools, and that's it. So slides will be available. They're not available yet, but they will be available on my website. And then you can, of course, connect with me on Twitter, on LinkedIn. If you have any questions, love to connect with you. Just let me know if you're on LinkedIn. You were at LASCON, so that I know who you are and that sort of thing. Would love to connect with you if you have any other questions. But I'll open it now for questions. Okay. Any questions? Okay. Yeah, so the question is, I mentioned about generative AI, and have I been able to use that to get updates or insights into threat models around? A little bit, but remember, generative AI, especially like chatbots and so forth that we have today, are based on already known data, and sometimes it could be a few years old or a little newer, depending on which version you get. So yeah, there's some things, but remember, what I was saying there is, use it for your own stuff, because you can find all kinds of things out there, and this is sort of what I was also implying, is that you still have to use some discernment. And Jim mentioned that in his keynote this morning. There's so much that you could take for granted on the data that you get back or the information you get back that you have to go through and make sure, is it right or not? Same thing with threat models on what are the real threats and so forth. So I would say be careful about the data that you feed it, and what generative AI and LLM you're using and so forth.
Do you ever use the generative AI like a rubber ducky? You know, talk to ChatGPT, tell it what's going on. And
ChatGPT, I have not used some of the others though.
Yeah, some of the others.
I've seen some examples though. If you're interested, there is an OWASP Slack channel, and some folks have given some really good examples of using some generative AIs to build some threat models there. You can go check that out. There's some good resources there. You're welcome.
Any other questions? Well, thank you very much, Robert.
Thank you.
We have a challenge coin and a gift card for you.
I think I got it.
Oh, okay,
Thank
great.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.